So welcome everybody to the first, hopefully of a few, mini online conference of Unspoken Pleasures, Philosophy and Social Work. Now this conference is a pilot really for myself and Martin to explore something that we have noticed there is a gap in the field of social work, which is thinking about philosophical ideas, philosophical traditions, some quite abstract theory, and how that applies and what it can tell us about social work. What we've seen over the last certainly 15 years, possibly longer, is a focusing of social work into a very functional profession and also a functional academic discipline, focusing on purely empirical research or focusing on, quote, what works. So continuously, if we do this, what's going to happen? If we do this, what's going to happen? Without thinking about broader pictures, without thinking about things that can't necessarily be researched empirically. And although there is a huge, of course, space for that and use for that, it is excluded a huge range of ideas, ways of thinking about the world, ways of thinking about who we are as human beings that we would like to introduce as part of social work thinking. And that is what this mini conference is all about. It's completely online, it's completely free, and we're hoping to keep it if we have another one completely free as well, because I think that's very important so that everybody can access it, whether you're an academic or not, whether you're a student or not, particularly if you have an experience of having a social worker in your life called people with lived experience. But we're doing this mini conference as a scoping exercise. So we're going to do 4 presentations, which will be myself and Martin first, Arlene and Paul second. We have scheduled in Aidan to go third. I'm not sure if Aidan is here at the moment, but I will keep up. And Mary to go fourth. If Aidan isn't here, Mary will go third and we will ad lib over number 4. When the presentations are going on, they will be conducted in the way the presenter has designed them, so they may take the whole 25 minutes. There may be Q&A at the end. What I would ask is that everybody, while the presentations are going on, everybody can make sure they're on mute. And if they would do want to ask a question, to raise your hand. If there's a Q&A session at the end, of course, the presenter will do that and run that in their own way. So without further ado, I'm very pleased and I'm very privileged and very I've got to say I'm very grateful to Derek Clifford, who's come to talk to us and introduce his journal, which we didn't go and hassle Derek and twist his arm. Luckily he came along and offered himself to come along. So great. So over to you, Derek.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me fine? Great. Well, thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. The topic today and the way you've introduced it is very relevant to the journal, which has been going for quite a while now. In fact, I proposed the idea of the journal nearly 20 years ago in 2004, and our first edition came out in 2006. And from the start, the whole idea was to look at values and ethical issues in the social professions, with a focus on social work, community work, but defining it broadly. But we particularly were interested in drawing on social and moral philosophy, as well as other areas such as social welfare, theory, practice. And we also were concerned about lived experience and practice experience. So the journal began life in 2006, and from the start it had a wide focus. We have always had some philosophical discussion. We've always had some empirical studies looking at how people actually behave in the world, but also we have a section for practice, which includes the experience of service users, carers, but academics as well. In the work that we do, we are human beings, and our practices and our experiences are also relevant, especially in the teaching of the topic. But the very first issue in 2006 included a paper on practical reason, presenting an Aristotelian interpretation of professional expertise and responsibility. The journal's now read across the globe. We get papers from India, Indonesia, Australia, the USA, and we often have special issues which focus on a particular aspect. Sometimes it's based on geography and cultural difference, as our Africa issue of 2014. Sometimes it's based on specialist welfare areas, such as learning disability. There was one in 2013 on that. Or on sex work, which there was one on 2022 on that. And sometimes it's based purely on philosophical discussions of, for example, family values. An issue came out, where was it, about 2012 on that particular topic. And we get all sorts of people writing for the paper. We certainly get some philosophers. We had a very interesting pair of papers, one by an Austrian philosopher who wrote about ethics, poverty, and children's vulnerability. And he's a philosopher of childhood. That's his specialist area. But what was interesting is that he subsequently wrote a practice piece. He was trained by Austrian social workers to become a foster parent. And his experience of being trained by social workers and his reflection on the philosophical issues that came up in that training period is very, very interesting. So we got someone writing as an academic, but also someone writing as having experienced being involved in social welfare. A recent paper from New Zealand is an excellent paper on decision variability in child protection, but the author, Emily Kettle, 2023, discusses concepts of respect, interactive universalism, and the ethics of care, and integrates that into a very, very competent and interesting paper. We have 4 current editors, one based in Germany, one based in the USA, and 2, Gideon Calder, who is a philosopher, and myself. I have a mixed social work and philosophy background. We're keen to welcome contributions to the journal from people interested in philosophy and social work, such as at this mini conference. And this could be, you could explore the possibility of a special issue. If you wanted to do that, you would need to contact the editors, and we would discuss that with you. You can certainly submit an individual or joint paper. That would have to go through the ScholarOne processing system, and I've put our website into the chat so that you can do that if you wish. But you could also write a personal account of ethical and philosophical issues in social welfare experience as a practitioner, as a teacher, as a service user, and sometimes these things are all the same. You can be all 3 at the same time. But you can write that, and that will be considered for the journal. That is not double-blind peer-reviewed. All our academic papers are double-blind peer-reviewed. Papers for the practice section are not, for fairly obvious reasons. We don't expect service users or carers to write reference papers, but they can write, and do sometimes write, very interesting papers on what their experience has been. So those are seen by our practice editors, and they sometimes will offer advice if a paper needs to be revised. All our papers must have some relevance to values, ethics, and social welfare. We've got a fairly short turnaround time. We can usually get things published within around about 12 months. Obviously, it depends how quickly reviewers respond to our requests. So we would really welcome interest from people on this site. So thank you again for inviting me. Finally, we are advertising for an editorial assistant, which would be suitable for anybody doing PhD studies, I think, and would be a useful way of them earning some extra money and also learning about this whole area. So I will send the advert to Michael, if that's okay, Michael, and you can include that later. So, yeah. The journal's been going for a while. It's still going strong. It's been increasing every single year since it started. Downloads across the globe have been increasing. I don't know how many tens of thousands of times they've been downloaded, but the publisher gives us the statistics every year. So I'm very pleased with the way things have gone. It's still going strong, and we'd be welcoming papers from people on this site. So please do contribute. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Derek, and a really interesting journal, it sounds like for all of us, really. And I think your idea about a special edition may well be something that a lot of us, particularly me and Martin, maybe you'll have to compete with us if anybody else is interested in this, might be getting in contact with you about. So thank you very much for that. Thank you for coming along and introducing. So in the next 15 minutes of introduction, I think it would be a good idea to give a little bit more detailed background from me and from Martin, probably, about what we're thinking about with this conference, what we're thinking about doing in the future, and why it's come about, more importantly. So I'll start, and Martin, you chip in, because I think this is a story for both of us, really. When I left practice in the end of 2018 and started in teaching in university in 2019 with Martin, this was one of the things that I had noticed about being in practice, and I'd done child protection management, child protection social work, youth homelessness, and quite a number of other children's social work areas, is that the social work field, or certainly social working in England, was dominated by systems theory, and almost only systems theory, and that had been going on even since I was being trained, but had narrowed and narrowed and narrowed, and that field, the idea of using almost any other theory had become rare and novel. And when I started working with Martin in South Bank University, one of the things that we started discussing was, what are the alternatives to this? And not just in the context of, could we look at attachment theory again, or could we look at Erikson's model of development, child development, or any of these kind of things, but really looking at a wide gamut of how we can look at introducing either ideas that have disappeared from social work or completely new ideas into social work as a kind of counterbalance to systems theory. I will say, for complete clarity's sake, I have been trained in systems theory by Morning Lane. I've used systems theory in numerous different positions and worked in a service in a local authority that was based on the reclaiming social work model, and I am not a fan of systems theory in any way, and those experiences have probably led me to that. So one of the things we discussed, talked about, was psychoanalysis, which is something that I'm quite interested in, particularly the Lacanian school of psychoanalysis, rather than the Freudian or the Jungian ones. Lacanian school being a little bit more unusual, a little bit more within the French philosophical traditions of people like Foucault, to name but one person, many others, of course, which holds a particular interest for me. So that's something I'm drawn to. But Martin introduced me to a number of things that he'd been interested in too, which were, and I am going to ask you, Martin, to just jump in and talk about these people, which is kind of ancient Greek philosophy and what that can tell us. And it's quite interesting to hear that Derek has also talked about and referenced, I think it was Aristotle, wasn't it? So Martin, do you want to just quickly jump in and say a little bit about that?
Oh, okay, yeah. I guess in terms of sort of really linking to what Michael's been talking about, is that for me, and when it's our discussions, there's been those gaps in practice. It's not and I'm talking probably mainly in the UK, because certainly linkage to theory, etc., is far more focused upon in other parts of Europe and USA. But really, sort of kind of our development, my development as well, was looking at other philosophy, the use of philosophy. And so, for example, for me, in terms of my own thinking, is my own developments around Aristotle. I mean, again, like Michael, my mind moves around to different things and so on. But it also links to Aristotle, also to the pre-Socratic, sort of pre-Socrates philosophers. And we've got a presentation we can show you at some point. But really, for me, it was actually seeing things differently. And let me tell you a little story. Once upon a time, actually, I've told Michael this one. Is that I once wrote a paper in which I referenced an ancient Greek philosopher as a reference. And the feedback from the reviewer was that it's a very old paper. I mean, it was Socrates. It was 2,500 years ago. But I thought it was really shows how much or how little different types of thinking, and thinking in that more critical sense, an open sense. Actually, we are very limited in the UK, and that is a part of my own thinking. So my own writings around actually asking questions from different voices, and voices that aren't always heard or don't quite fit systems theories, as Michael was talking about. And so it says that's how we sort of develop the podcast, was really as in a more open way and looking at things in different ways. So looking, for example, at Nietzsche, for example, who isn't talked about in traditional social work practices, and yet in the rest of Europe, Nietzsche is one of the main, a very important figure in the European countries, and using him in his more critical approach. And so the voices of these people who are non-existent or outside our systems in the UK, and really the podcast is as much about different voices, or voices that don't fit in. And Nietzsche, for example, and one of the reasons why we're interested in Nietzsche is that Nietzsche is not discussed, to the best of my knowledge, or in the UK writings, and because Nietzsche doesn't fit our understanding of social work, whereas in other European countries, Nietzsche is a major thinker. So really that's where both of us come to, and we certainly had a very, at the beginning, we had a, I'm not sure how should I talk about, we had a very confident and interesting discussion of Nietzsche in the beginning, because I certainly had no, and I had read him many years ago, or tried to, but in my own view, originally, I had no belief that Nietzsche had anything to do with social work. Now, Michael has persuaded me otherwise, but it took me a lot of reading and rereading. But it comes back to that idea of, and why Nietzsche, for us, is a particular issue. It is a different thinking. It is a contrary thinking. So I imagine that Nietzsche is the sort of person, when you meet him, he will be at the beginning very pleasant, but you'd end up, probably what he would do, he'd walk off in a fit of pique, and he'll never speak to us again. But what Nietzsche does, among other thinkers, who often whose voices are lost or hidden, actually they offer us something different, different ways of asking questions, challenging established ways of thinking, and obviously other thinkers, obviously like Foucault, etc. And Foucault was in fact a great admirer of Nietzsche. So those were sort of where our thinking had sort of started and begun, and it's been, I guess, developed, Michael, that actually Michael did manage to persuade me to see how Nietzsche, for example, can help a different kind of thinking for us who work in social work in the UK.
Great, yes. That's good to hear that I've managed to have that convincing influence, because certainly sometimes when we're having a discussion, I don't know whether I'm talking sense or completely going off track. But one of the things, this is where we started, and this is where me and Martin started really thinking about, we need to have other alternative views and alternative ways of thinking about social work. But one of the things I think we've come to realize quite significant gap for us is that we have very Martin's mentioned his, I've mentioned mine. We're very particular and quite narrow interests in the or knowledge. And both of ours is really rooted in Western European philosophical traditions. And one of the things about doing this, opening up to do a conference, opening up to do a podcast, opening up to hopefully do another conference, is to bring people who have very different ideas than us and very different perspectives than just mine and Martin's in. And particularly, I'm very aware that our thinking and our traditions and our way of doing this is from quite an atheist point of view. It's from a very white point of view, and it's also actually come from quite a very male point of view. And these are a lot of these philosophers that we are talking about fit all of those categories, and that's not all the ideas that are out there and all the ways of thinking about things by any means. There are incredibly interesting things that are starting to be talked about by applying really quite well-known feminist ideas to the work with mothers who are experiencing domestic violence, for instance. But I'm not an expert in that. And it might not be my place to say that I am an expert in that. There are very interesting traditions, religious traditions, thinking about how social work can be seen from a Latin American liberation theologist perspective. There are very interesting, and luckily the IFSW, the International Federation of Social Workers, has put this in their 5-year plan to look at Ubuntu and African ways and African cultural ways of thinking about social work. And I think one of the things we wanted to do with this conference and podcast and everything like that is to give the space for people with that knowledge, those ideas, those other ways of thinking, the space to be able to do that, and knowing we're not the people to do it. Me and Martin just probably aren't, but we are people who have enough influence or power or whatever you might say to put a space so that other people can do it. And that's really what this mini conference, and hopefully a bigger conference, and anybody who wants to get involved in a podcast, as Derek has slightly plugged the journal, I'm going to plug the podcast. If anybody wants to get involved in it, it is literally just for you to tell us about the ideas, and we can pull it out, question it, improve our thinking, definitely, but hopefully a lot of other people's. And if anybody has listened to In Our Time with Melvin Bragg, it will be like a soft and nicer version of that, I'm hoping, rather than just being ploughed through a philosophical debate. So that's it, really. Are there any? We've got 5 minutes before we start mine and Martin's presentation on Nietzsche, which hopefully will give you a flavour of what we're thinking about with Nietzsche and how he applies to social work. Are there any comments or questions before we start? And please just turn your microphone on and say if there are. I know we've got some social work students here as well, so from who've been taught by me. So hopefully the fact you've come here means you wanted to hear more from me. So if you have any questions or anything, pop them in the chat or let us know. Otherwise, we will maybe start our presentation a little bit early. Sharika, you've just popped your hand up.
Mike, I was just, I found it interesting when Martin was saying that you were very persuasive, because like in teaching, I believe that you are as well, because you've given us as students a lot of insights into different theories. So I can see you being very persuasive in your conversations with him. So it was interesting to hear that.
Well, thank you very much, Sharika. That's really good to have that bit of ego boost before I do my presentation. Hopefully the influence has been benevolent rather than malevolent, but you know, it's always a bit somebody with influence who's always got that power, haven't they? Which is exactly what we're just about to talk